Vanessa Davis, and I am one of the program directors here. I want to welcome you on behalf of myself and Chris Fowler over there, who's been doing this for a long, long time. Couple of housekeeping items to remind you of. We are webcasting this. That's why I'm bothering with the microphone. When we get to the question and answer period, we're going to have some mics and ask you to use that as well. That also means that the webcast will be archived to the coordinating board site, and for those folks that are watching it via webcast right now, we also will be posting as PDFs the presentation file as well as the other handouts that we have, so you will have access to those items. We're going to talk today about the Minority Health Research and Education Program grant. Would you go ahead and move it to the next slide? You should just have to click. Oh. There we go. So what I want to spend a little bit of time doing, I know that most of you have been involved with this grant before, but I want to spend a few moments looking at an overview of the competition. And then we're going to spend the bulk of our time today talking about the key definitions, the specifics of the two grants, the pipeline grant and then the statewide website grant. Talk a little bit more generally about website development, about the grant writing tips, the review process, and then I'd like to leave a fairly significant chunk for questions and answers. One other thing to remind you of, there are two of these RFPs out there, and what that means is that we have two different due dates. So just to remind you, September 28th is the due date for the Pipeline Education Grant. So that will be due upstairs in Academic Affairs offices by 5 p.m. on September 28th. For those of you that are going to be applying for the Website Development Grant, that will be due by 5 p.m. upstairs in the Academic Affairs office on October 5th. So two different RFPs, two different due dates, September 28th for Pipeline, October 5th for the statewide Website Development Grant. All right. So a quick overview of the Minority Health Grant Program. Historically, this came out in 1999 from the 76th Legislative Session, HB 1945. And of course, this is using the tobacco funds money from the tobacco settlement. The goal is to address minority health issues and research, educational programs, and educational programs that address minority health issues. Currently, we're targeting two different types of grants as well as two different approaches to this goal. The first is looking at pipeline issues. How do we increase the number of students in the educational pipeline who can not only successfully apply and be accepted into an undergraduate or graduate program, but successfully complete those programs? And then the second is looking at information sharing. How do we, as a state, share what is going on in the various regions, and looking specifically at how do we begin to share best and good practices. Now, of course, the theory behind all of this is that, and studies have shown, that one of the best ways to begin to address the disparities in healthcare that many minorities are presented with in the United States is to diversify the healthcare workforce. So gives you a little bit of the background and the context and why specifically we have evolved over the last few years into looking at these two particular pieces of it for this RFP cycle. I want to talk a little bit about the key terms so that we have no confusion over that. We'll start with eligible institutions because there is a little bit of a difference here than there is with some of the other grants that the coordinating board administers. we're looking at public and private accredited general academic and health-related institutions and centers for teacher education. Now, what that means in terms of the Centers for Teacher Education are there's 4 private historically black colleges and universities in the state that have been designated by the legislature as a center for teacher education. That would be Texas College, Wiley College, Paul Quinn, and Houston-Tillotson. So those are the only 4 of the private institutions that are eligible. We're also looking at general academic and health-related institutions. So that would be 4-year institutions. Now, an important caveat here is that last point there. Other higher education institutions, including community colleges, are not eligible to apply for the MHGP grants. However, they can be funded partners. So for those of you that are coming from community colleges, although you technically cannot apply for this grant, you can work in partnership with one of those 4-year general education institutions or one of the health science institutions as a funded partner, but you wouldn't be taking the lead. Also, actually, if you'll go back to that last slide there for a sec, Chris, one of the other things that I want to point out here is the additional requirement is that the institution must be conducting research for educational programs that address minority health issues or in partnership with minority organizations, colleges, or universities. And that organization piece means that you don't necessarily have to partner with another academic institution, but you can be partnering with a nonprofit. So, for example, you might be partnering with LULAC, or you might be partnering with the Urban League or the NAACP, or another minority organization. So that leads us to the next thing about project directors. You have the opportunity to have up to 2 project directors on the MHTP grants. The principal investigator or educator who is responsible for the implementation and the oversight is how we define a project director. So it's going to be the person where the buck stops, as Harry Truman used to have on his desk. You know, Harry always had that sign on the Oval Office desk that said, "The buck stops here." Well, that's your project director. The buck stops with them. They must be either a full-time faculty member in a tenured or tenure-track position or a research professional in a permanent position. And that's very important, particularly when we're looking at things like the educational pipeline grants. Because there's going to be curriculum issues, it's very important that the person who is the project director have those faculty credentials, or they have the research credentials that would also be appropriate. So that's sort of one of those where there's not a lot of wiggle room there. Full-time faculty member in a tenure-track position, or a research professional in a permanent position. You may name one additional individual to be a co-project director. They must still fulfill the same requirements as the project director. Both of them have to be full-time faculty member, tenured or tenure-track, or full-time research.
If you're partnering with
Can the co-project director, the question is, if you're partnering with a community college, can the community college, can one of the co-project directors be at the community college level?
No. Both of them have to come from
Let me try that again. Both of them have to come from the grantee institution.
Okay, one of the other key terms here is matching funds. Because we want to get as much bang out of the buck as we can. We do not have a set required percentage of funds that must be matched. Try saying that fast 10 times. We do consider 15% to be a significant number, and you will receive special credit for that during the review process. And when we go over the review process and the criteria and evaluation sheet that reviewers will be using, we'll talk more about that then. Matching funds, and this is very, very important, matching funds cannot come from state-funded programs or appropriations. So you can't take money that the state of Texas has given you for something else and slip it in there as matching funds. Yeah, I know that we've got a great history of robbing Peter to pay Paul, but won't work this time. So these have to be new monies, new external monies or in-kind donations. So, for example, if you're partnering with a community college, you can't say that they're going to kick in 15% and call that matching funds. Needs to be external monies. New external monies could also be in-kind donations. You must include a letter of support in your application packet verifying those matching funds. And that there's two things there that are important to that. There has to be verification that the funds are being matched. Whoever's going to give them to you has to say that, yeah, we're really giving them to them. It also has to be in your application packet. Don't send it in ahead of time. Don't send it in after you've FedExed the packet in. We want everything there in one place. Okay? The other key definition that has to be defined here is, what do we mean by minority? And for the purposes of this granting process, a minority is defined as a particular racial or ethnic group that is underrepresented in one or more areas of health research or health education. And that means that when we talk specifically about minority college or university and minority organization, for minority college and university, we're using the definition that the Department of Education uses. And that means a designated Department of Education, designated Hispanic serving institution or historically black institution. Now, for minority organizations, that could be a public or private entity located in Texas, needs to be Texas-based, that is affiliated with one or more underrepresented ethnic or racial groups. And the organization also should have documented experience in conducting research and education in minority health issues. So, you know, very common sense. Don't pull some idiot off the street. You want to make sure that they've got the qualifications there. To talk a little bit specifically about the pipeline grant, since we've got two of these, remember. The focus on the pipeline grant is for innovative research and educational projects, again with the aim of increasing the number of students who can successfully apply, be admitted, and complete undergraduate and graduate training in health-related fields. In this grant RFP, we're going to be spanning all levels of instruction. So you can be writing a pipeline grant that's going to focus on elementary education if you want. There are certainly those that have made very compelling arguments that if you want to have students who have the mathematical and critical thinking and reading and writing skills to be successfully admitted to an undergraduate or graduate program, you have to start them early. So you might be looking at elementary education. You might focus on secondary education. You might focus on a college level that would focus on the transition from college to to graduate school, post-baccalaureate work. So this is spanning all instructional levels. Now, do we necessarily expect that you're going to try to bite off all levels? No. But you have the opportunity to work with all instructional levels here. And again, the focus is preparing minority students to be successful in these fields. It's specifically looking at degree programs in allied health, biomedical sciences, dentistry, medicine, nursing, pharmacy, and or public health. So it spans all of the health-related fields. Specifically, we are interested in grant proposals that focus on one and or two large areas, helping students with the personal issues that may prevent them from being successful in their educational careers, as well as helping students with the academic issues that may be preventing them from being successful in their professional and educational careers. Talk a little bit about that first category. One of the things that is very useful from a retention point is being able to identify the students that are going to be the most at risk. It's hard to provide services for students if you don't know who you need to provide them for. And so one of the things that we're interested in looking at is the creation and the use of an at-risk student assessment. How do you figure out from the very moment they set foot on a campus that this is a student who's going to be at risk and is going to need specific services if they're going to be successful? We're also interested in that same sort of category of helping the students' personal development, mentoring programs so that they have the academic and professional support, looking at personal family support programs. We know both from studies and from anecdotal evidence, I imagine that there's well over 100 years of experience in this room right now. We know that family issues play a huge role in our students' abilities to successfully complete programs. We know that those personal stressors can make or break an otherwise gifted student. And so we're interested in looking at programs that would help students with those personal issues, that would provide them with the appropriate social, emotional supports. And then we also know that work study has been shown to be incredibly effective in assisting students to finish a program. We know that from the financial piece, but we also know from various studies that, at least in some cases, there is a high correlation. We don't know if it's causality, but we know that there's a significant correlation between students who receive work study and students who graduate. In fact, actually a higher correlation with work study than with grants. So work study also is something that we are interested in exploring in this grant cycle. And then there are the educational pieces. Critical thinking skills, English language arts, reading comprehension, science and math. Now, when we look at pipeline, and face it, we're dealing a lot with the STEM disciplines, the science and math piece is sort of the no-brainer. But a student can't do good science if they can't read and write. They can't approach a complex problem in the laboratory or in the clinic if they can't think critically. So we're also interested in looking at pipeline programs that are going to address these other fields of language arts, reading comprehension, critical thinking skills. I think we can all assume that we want our healthcare providers to be able to read and write and think. Due date, as I said, for the pipeline grant is September 28th at 5 p.m. The funding period, December 2007, we're hoping early December. We'll be able to announce funding decisions through August 2009. And as in past years, there is the possibility for applying for one additional grant cycle. The website development grant is something new, and it's a little bit different. I actually want to spend a little bit more time talking about this one. It's the same focus in some ways, but this is really focused on the dissemination of information. We are an awfully big state, and as I grew up in West Texas, so I've always had a very good grasp of the size of our state. That's never been a problem for me. But I was in Atlanta at a Southern Regional Education Board meeting a couple of months ago, and was sitting around the room. We had representatives from all of the other member states and their higher ed departments, and I realized, I had an epiphany in the middle of this meeting, that I have great respect for my colleagues in Mississippi and Georgia and Alabama and Tennessee. Did my graduate work in Tennessee. but they're not dealing with nearly as many schools and students as we are. I mean, it's a drop in the bucket compared to what we're dealing with. And one of the things that we're very, very seriously interested in is finding ways to better disseminate what's going on in the far corners of Texas. And let's face it, it's a big state. You can't easily travel. And so we're very interested in looking at how we can leverage new technologies, particularly Web 2.0 technologies, to provide a clearinghouse for those best practices. We're also aware, though, that this website is going to be dealing with a number of different constituencies. There's the obvious constituency of you folks. San Antonio College needs to know what's going on at UTEP and vice versa. UNT should know what's going on in Brownsville. There needs to be a way to share the good work that you're already doing. Because what works one place with some tweaking may work someplace else. And there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Everybody, I'm sure, has more than enough on their plates. As one of my colleagues here says, I don't have a plate anymore, I've got a platter, and it's fallen off of that. So the first and most obvious constituency for this website is going to be you guys. However, there's going to be other constituencies as well. Students are one of the constituencies. We're envisioning something that a junior high or a high school or maybe even an elementary school student could go to get career information. Gee, I think I want to be a doctor. Well, what does that mean? And what sort of skills do I need to be successful? What sort of classes should I be taking now if I want to be prepared for a pre-med degree in college? What are the opportunities in nursing? What are the opportunities in physical therapy? What are the opportunities in public health? I mean, my guess is that most students probably in high school aren't thinking, oh, I want to go work for the CDC. But, I've got some friends that do that. That's pretty cool work. And so one of the possible constituencies for this website is for students. It can be a source for them to be able to get career information. What are the possibilities out there? And what should I be doing to prepare myself right now? How can I learn more? One of the other constituencies that we would envision for this website would be parents. Wow, my son or daughter is kind of interested in medicine. What should I know to help them? What programs are there in Texas? What should they be doing right now in their schools to prepare themselves? And what is in store for them? How can I be helping them right now? Another constituency that we imagine might exist would be counselors on the high school level, guidance counselors. I've got a student here who's interested in neuroscience. I had a very smart high school counselor when I was at Lehigh and Midland. But there weren't many of my classmates that were interested in neuroscience. That wasn't something that the counselor could sort of pull out of her files. So this site would be a clearinghouse for that group as well, potentially. A way for them to be able to quickly access information that would help them with the interests of their students. We also imagine that one of the constituencies could be those possibly elementary, junior high, I think I'm supposed to say middle school now, middle school and high school teachers in those STEM fields. If I'm a middle school biology teacher, it would be great to be able to look to a website and see what other middle school biology teachers are doing to get their students interested in this field. What sort of curriculums are out there? So we envision that this site could potentially address a number of constituencies. We also are requesting that grant proposals address at least 2 of these areas. We don't expect that you're going to be able to create a website that's going to be able to do everything for everyone. But we would like to see it have a wide appeal, and that it should be focusing at least initially on 2 of the special interest areas, whether that be allied health, biomedical science, personal family support, dentistry, medicine, nursing, pharmacy, public health, critical thinking, English language arts, reading comprehension, science and math. Okay. So, due date for this one is a little bit later, October 5th. Again, 5 p.m. Same funding period, December 2007. We hope to be able to make an announcement at the beginning of that month through August 31st, 2009. And again, the possibility of applying for 1 additional grant cycle of funds. Let me stop right there real quickly and see if there's any questions. Okay. So, what I'd like to do then is talk a little bit about some grant writing tips. This will be a little bit more general. One of the handouts that you have obviously the handout of the, you've got the handout of the presentation. The second handout, though, is a more specific document with tips on grant writing. What is it that you can do to craft a grant proposal that has the greatest chances of success? And that means thinking very carefully about audience. My previous life before coming to the coordinating board was a university professor. And I taught a lot of substantial writing component courses. I wasn't an English professor, but I taught a lot of these substantial writing component courses. And I was thinking the other day as I was prepping this, that the same stuff that I would tell my students to be thinking about are the same things that we need to think about as grant writers. And I include myself in that because I've been working on writing a couple of grant proposals too. It's the basic stuff, but I think that we forget it sometimes. And so the very first thing to think about is your audience. If you want to basically your grant proposal is an argument. You're preparing an argument to get funding. You need to give me money. And we know in Texas it's hard to get money sometimes. So it's got to be a strong argument. Well, we all know when we're trying to convince our husband or our wife or our kids to do something, we've got to give them well, maybe not with the kids. We usually have to give them good reasons. We have to make it convincing. And so that's what you're doing with your grant, is you're thinking about who your audience is and how do you convince that specific audience. Well, one of the very first things, in fact, the 2 first things that your reviewer is going to see that can make or break it before they even read past page 2 is the cover sheet and the project abstract. And if you're like me, you probably, in the past when I've written, actually go back. In the past when you've, there we go. In the past when I've written grants, it's usually at the 11th hour, I have to admit. I'm going to guess that most of us in here and probably most folks watching on the web have had some of those burning the midnight oil to get the RFP out on time, to get the proposal out on time. And usually by that point, the last things I do are the abstract and the cover sheet. And I'm not always quite awake at that point. I'm not thinking very clearly. We sort of do it as an afterthought. But when you think about it, it doesn't make sense to do it that way, because that's the first thing that your reviewer is going to see. And if there are obvious mistakes on that cover sheet that doesn't exactly incline them kindly to you. So be careful with that cover sheet. And then when you think about the project abstract, I mean, that's just one page. And we're only talking a couple of paragraphs here. But that is so crucial because that's what's going to give the reviewer a snapshot of your project. And it's so important to make sure that the picture that they get is crystal clear, that it's not blurry. They need to be able to see what you're going to do, why you're going to do it, how you're going to do it, and how you're going to figure out if you did it. And it needs to be concise, it needs to be clear, and it needs to be in language that anyone can understand. So always think about your audience. Now, when we get into the meat of the proposal, one of the very first things that you're going to need to do is craft a problem statement. What is it that your proposal is trying to fix? What will your project do? And why should it be funded? What's the reason for the application? And it needs to be client-focused and descriptive. You need to be able to convey the hearts and the souls and the sinew and the muscles of who's going to benefit from your project. Don't make it abstract. Show who the people are that are going to benefit. Be descriptive and be informative with accurate and contemporary information. So that means don't talk in generalities here. Don't just say, hey, you know, we have problems graduating minority students. Don't leave it in the general. You need to be able to say, our institution has an X graduation rate for minority students. You need to be able to show specifically what the problem is. And I know this sounds silly, but it's very easy to do in the rush of things. You need to make sure that that information is current. What is the latest and greatest figures? You've got to make sure it's accurate. And you've got to make sure that the reviewer can verify it. Show where you've gotten your information from. And I think that's one of those things that sometimes it's really easy for us to forget to do. But we all know that some sources are better than others. Some sources hold more water than other sources do. And this is, again, all part of your strategy of how are you going to craft the best argument. If you can show a reviewer that you've done your homework, that you've done your research, and that you know what the best sources for that research are, you've already subliminally made the point that you know the information, that you will be able to do a good job of constructing this project. My very first year out of graduate school, I was teaching in rural northern Missouri. And this was when the web was first sort of being discovered by my students. And I had a freshman student who was writing a research paper. And he had one source through his entire paper, and it was a website. And so I thought, I'm going to look this up on my computer. I looked the website up, and I thought, this is not very informative. I pressed the little go to the homepage button. It was a second grade class. That was his sole source, a second grade class website for a college level research paper. I called the kid into my office. I said, tell me about this site. Who wrote it? I don't know. I said, well, let's look. I said, now, do you think that in the grand scheme of what sources are most valid and viable and most convincing to your audience, me, that this was your best choice? Oh, I guess not. Like, yeah. I think you're going to be repeating the class next semester. None of us would do something as silly as that. But we need to use that authority of those references to make our points. Use the best information out there. Show your reviewer that you've done that. An example of a good problem statement. Again, we want to be specific and concise. Over the last 5 years, 15 to 20% of our Bachelor of Science and Public Health students, with the number being 50 students, failed statistics. They failed a specific course. Of those who failed the course, 50% dropped out of the public health program. This problem statement lays it out. Gives the time period, gives the specific number of students in the program, the specific percentage who have failed that course, and then it shows maybe not a causality, but it shows a strong correlation between failure of that course and failure of the program. Okay. So that would be a very strong problem statement. In addition, you want to have a strong goal. The goal is the overarching result of the project. It's going to oftentimes be a non-measurable statement of what will be accomplished. Your goal is going to be a little bit more general here. So whereas your problem statement is very specific, your goal is going to be more broadly focused. We want to reduce the failure rate in statistics and improve other support services so that these at-risk students will continue in the public health program. The goal is not the time at which to start figuring numbers. That comes with objectives, it comes with evaluation. But your goal needs to say, you've set out what the problem is, so now you're setting out, this is how we're going to respond to the problem. This is how we're going to fix it. And then where you begin to get more specific again is in your objectives. Sometimes these are called deliverables. And for those of you that are at any institutions that are either going through the SACS review process or have recently gone through the Great Southern Association of Colleges and Schools review process, you all can probably write objectives and deliverables in your sleep because this is what they want. This is where we get down to the nitty-gritty. These are the measures by which the success of the project will be evaluated. These are your benchmarks. They have to be clear targets for specific actions, and they have to be measurable. And I just want to say here, you need to think about the objectives and the deliverables also within the context of your evaluation methodology. Because you're going to be using the objectives and the deliverables to figure out what the success of your project is. You'll be applying the methodology to these things. So you've got to make sure that these are realistic. Okay? Don't set yourself up for failure. Don't promise the moon and then only be able to manage a piece of the sun or a piece of pie. You got to make sure that it's a realistic goal. And you've got to make sure that it's measurable, that you can quantify it. You can show this happened or didn't happen. So an example of an objective or a deliverable might be increase the number of hours that tutoring is available by 50% during the first year. Okay? So a good objective or deliverable is going to have two components. It's going to have very specifically what we're going to do, and it's going to have very specifically when it's going to be done by. So it's got a good objective and deliverable has those two components to it. This is what we're going to do. It's sort of how we're going to do it. And this is when it's going to be done. So it's got a chronology piece to it as well. Another example would be improve access to the department's academic services by offering at least 5 study skill presentations during the fall semester. Okay? Going to offer 5 study skill presentations. It's going to happen in the fall. Place statistics tutorial software on all lab computers for student use. This last one is kind of strong, but it's not as strong as the other two. What's the last one missing? It's missing the timeline. It's missing the when. So a really strong objective will have what you're going to do and when you're going to do it by, because these are your benchmarks. This is how you measure your success. Okay. And then there is the budget, which, let's face it, is sort of the heart and soul. Be accurate, be specific, and be complete. Make sure that what you're asking for is an accurate number. This isn't the time to eyeball it. This is the time to do a little bit of research. You know, if you're going to include 10 computers, don't just say, don't just think, okay, you know, I think I saw on television that Dell's offering a computer for about $500, so 10 of them, see, 10 times 500, that'd be about 5,000. Let's add in an extra 1,000 just to be on the safe side. Don't eyeball it here. Do your research. I know that we need this number of machines. I know that it's at this price. That means there will be this cost. Be accurate and specific. And again, be specific about what you're asking for. There should not be a miscellaneous category in your budget. Okay? You need to think through everything that you're going to need, and if you think there's going to be some hiccups along the way, you need to try to figure out what they're going to be and build them into the budget. And again, think about who your audience is here. You're going to have peer reviewers. You've got to convince these reviewers that you have thought this project through, that you are so prepared to do it that you've even thought through what might go wrong and have planned for it. That's going to be a strong proposal. And put yourself in their shoes. Isn't that the sort of proposal that you would want to fund? Wouldn't you be more inclined to say, yeah, you should fund this person because they've thought through everything, they're accurate, they're specific, I can tell that they've figured out what might go wrong and they've planned for it. Yeah, I think I'd rather fund this person than the person over here who hadn't really done their homework, is really general and vague, has this $10,000 miscellaneous expenses category here. I mean, what's that for? And put yourself in your reviewer's shoes. Consider your audience. I mean, your budget needs to be complete. You need to think through what those extenuating circumstances, what those plans, what those road bumps might be, and how you're going to address them. Again, to sort of reiterate on the budget piece, you will need to take into consideration what the grant allows to be funded and what it doesn't. Don't stick stuff in your budget that we're not going to fund. Don't put cell phones in there. Don't put indirect costs in there. I know when you get to apply for a federal grant, then your institution can stick in indirect costs, but it doesn't work that way with this one. So don't put those indirect costs in there. Read very carefully what is allowable and what isn't allowable, because I can promise you the reviewers are going to be told to strip out what's not allowable. So you're not going to get that money. You can put it in there, but you're not going to get it. And the message that it sends, if it's in there, is that you didn't read the directions very closely or you decided you didn't need to follow them, which, again, is not the message you want to be sending to your reviewer. Evaluation methodologies. The other really important component that oftentimes gets sort of short shrift. You've got to explain how your project will be measured. How do you know if you've been successful? And again, this fits in with those objectives. The deliverables, the objectives, or the barometer, the evaluation methodology shows how you're going to read that barometer. It should be as specific as possible. It has to be closely aligned with the project goals and objectives. In general, there are two types of evaluations. There are summative evaluations and there are formative evaluations. Summative evaluation methods are just that. They look at the overall success at the end of the project. They look at the sum total. Formative evaluations tend to take place throughout the project and tend to look more at process. Are our methods working? And there's a place for both types of evaluation methodologies in a really strong grant proposal. Clearly, the summative is usually the one that we focus the most on. You got to prove to your funder that you've done what you said you were going to do. But again, anybody that's been going through or is going through the SACS review process knows that good evaluation is ongoing. That you are constantly looking at the success of your program, and you are using the results of evaluation to go back and improve and tweak and change so that you get the best outcome along the way. So as you're writing your proposals, be aware of the need for probably both of those kinds of evaluation methodologies, the summative and the formative. How are you going to show that you've done what you said you were going to do, but how are you going to be looking at the success of your project on an ongoing level and using those results to improve? A few examples of evaluation methodology. Reduce the failure rate in statistics by 50%. So again, we're going to go back to our statistics example. We'll be successful. We're going to look at the failure rate. Okay, that one's pretty straightforward. We're going to look at dropout rate. We're going to say this number of computers will have things. We're going to say this number of students will attend study skill workshops, and then you count the numbers. Okay. So there's a place for quantitative assessment, and that's very important. Now, you might also, in a more formative methodology, you might also do things like use surveys, focus groups, as a type of formative methodology. You need to know not just that there have been bodies in those seats, but you need to know whether or not those students thought that that information was valuable to them. How do you do that? You can give them a survey. I've always found with college students that bribing them with pizza is a good idea. You can have a focus group. Hey, spend an hour talking with us about this, and we'll feed you pizza and soda. It works really well with college students, actually. In fact, my memory is from faculty meetings, it worked really well with college faculty, too, sometimes. That would be a more qualitative form of evaluation and assessment. That's going to be most likely one of those formative types of assessment. So looking at on an ongoing basis. And in a good proposal, there's room for both. And you probably should think about having both and how they can help you with different aspects of your proposal. Okay. So before we move on to talking about the review process, any questions about the grant writing tips, the portions of the grant, some of the things to look out for? I know that this is less than ideal to throw a lot of information at you at once. A couple of other general tips that are the handout, the second handout on the grant writing tips goes into a lot more detail. A couple of general things, though, that I want to put a plug in for, which in part comes from years and years and years of grading papers. When you think of your audience, and let's just be very practical and pragmatic here for a moment. How many of you have reviewed grants before? All right. How many did you do in one sitting? Not many? Two? Oh, y'all got lucky. Well, that's true. That's true. How many did you have total to do? A lot. Okay. My guess is the reason why you only did 2 or 3 in one sitting is because by the end of the second one, your head was swimming and your eyes were crossing, weren't they? Think about your reviewer. They're going to have 8 or 10 20 or so page reviews to assess. They're only going to have a couple of weeks to do it. You want to make things as clear and as easy on them as possible. And it's greatly appreciated. I told my students once, I said, you know, by the time I hit the 30th paper and I see the same silly typo 30 times, I'm much less happy with it the 30th time and much less forgiving the 30th time than I was the first 5. Okay? Think about your audience. Think about your reviewer. Make sure that that proposal is perfect. Proofread it, proofread it, proofread it. Edit it. Have other people proofread it and edit it, because it doesn't matter how many times you look at something. You know what you meant to write, so your mind just automatically fills in the blanks. Have your colleagues edit it, and edit it not just for mechanics but for content. Make sure what you're writing is clear, concise, precise, and accurate. And this is really important, make sure that a reasonably intelligent person can understand it. I like to think that I'm a reasonably intelligent person. However, if I get a proposal to review that is so dense with technical jargon that it looks like a different language than English, it kind of makes it difficult for me to do a really serious, fair review of it. So again, think about your audience. It's an intelligent person who has some knowledge of your field, but it's probably a general knowledge of the field. It may not be a specific knowledge of the field. So make sure that the language that you use can be understood by all of them. And you know, the other thing that I've learned in higher ed and academia is that each campus has its own language. You know, the acronym that's used at one campus is different than what's used at the other, and we kind of forget that because we've got our little places where we live, and we forget that what I call it here may not be what they call it there. The world really doesn't center on us. I know that's hard to believe sometimes. So make sure that you proofread it. Make sure that you edit it. Make sure that a number of different sets of eyes actually look at it. And make sure that you've written it in language that can be understood. And that will go a far, far way with the reviewers who are looking at it. And for those of you that have reviewed, am I right? That helps a lot. So just again, you know, think about your audience. Be nice to them. And that gets us to what that review process looks like. We use a 6-step grant award process here. There will be a preliminary screening done by coordinating board staff, and that's the point at which we look and see, does the application have in it what it's supposed to have in it? Are all the parts and pieces there? Which means you really need to make sure that all the parts and pieces are there. We're not going to let stuff trickle in after the fact. Okay? If it doesn't have the parts and the pieces, it doesn't go on to the next stage, which is the peer review. Okay? So we start with a preliminary screening. We go with a peer review after that, where applications will be reviewed by your peers, by the people that know this area. And these are folks that are drawn from all around the state. From there, the staff makes recommendations to the coordinating board. The coordinating board makes the final funding decision. We anticipate that that would be in early December. The grants contract will be sent out very shortly after that. And payment is a little different this time around on these grants. In the past, you had quarterly payments. This time there will be biennial payments. So the payment schedule will be twice a year rather than 4 times a year. So more money, but not as often. And then, of course, there is that first year review. because you all know that there's a caveat in that grant that upon the completion of the first year review, staff can make the decision to not go forward with the second year if it doesn't look like you're doing what you said you were going to do or doing anything at all. So that first year review is pretty important as well. And again, that should be a function of that formative evaluation process that you're doing on an ongoing basis. And should really be as useful for you as it is for us. I mean, it's pretty good to take stock halfway through and see formally how things are working and what sort of changes might need to be made and to trumpet your successes. The peer review criteria that we use, looking at significance of research and the educational project. And you'll notice that there are two pieces here that are weighted the highest. The significance piece is weighted highly with 30 points. The evaluation and expected outcomes is weighted highly with 30 points as well. Okay? So when we just look at the weight, those are actually the two most important things. That you
Vanessa?
Jeez.
I'm sorry. I wanted to mention a few things after years of looking at these proposals about what are the real deal breakers. We're actually a lot kinder to people and their mistakes than a lot of people. You probably experienced that if you've ever submitted a federal grant that had a little problem and you found it back in the mail 2 weeks later. Well, there are 3 deal breakers, according to us, when we return your proposal to us. And I wanted to mention this. I'm
Please.
sorry to scare you.
That's okay.
First is you missed the deadline. That's standard. It's just a matter of fairness that you submit. You have the same amount of time as the next guy in submitting the proposal, preparing it and submitting it. The second one is if on the cover pages, if you as the PI have not signed the proposal, more importantly, that your institutional representative has not signed the proposal. What's that's telling us is that it hasn't gotten the endorsement of your institution, and that is huge in the grant awarding business. And and the third one is, and this is again as a matter of fairness, we have received proposals where the project description, which is where really the bulk of the text is single spaced. It has to be double spaced. Again, you have the same amount of space as everyone else to explain what you want to do. And of course, we have type font requirements and page margins that you also need to subscribe to. I'm sorry to scare you.
No, that's okay.
I wanted to make those few points for you.
And to sort of reiterate what Chris said about the double spacing and the margin requirements and things like that. I remember the most frightening aspect of finishing my dissertation was not my defense. It was the ruler lady. Yeah. So some other folks have had this experience too. You could be done with classes at Vanderbilt. You could have passed. Your committee could have signed off on everything, but you had to walk that copy over to Alexander Hall, up on the 3rd floor, and you took it to one of the administrative assistants whose primary job was to take it, and she would literally pull out the ruler and start measuring margins. And if your margins weren't exact, you had to go back and reformat it. And I was lucky. This was the sort of rudimentary days of word processing. The ones that really had nightmares about it were the ones back in the typewriter age. But you know, I'm not going to whip out my ruler on these things. Unless I have to. I don't want to put anyone else through that trauma. I still have nightmares about that. But it's like Chris said, it is a matter of fairness, really, on this. It's not just trying to be nitpicky. It's trying to make sure that everybody has the same amount of space to make their argument and to make their case. So that double space thing actually is a deal breaker. And no fudging around with the margins either. Nope, go back. No, backwards. Okay. The second most weighted aspects in the peer review process is project design and cost effectiveness. And really you should sort of think about these numbers here as showing where the priorities are. So most importantly is showing significance in evaluation. Second in the priority list is the project design and the cost effectiveness. Have you designed a project that is going to be feasible and viable? Is it cost effective? Are you being, very simply put, are you being a good steward of the state monies? Because in essence, you're getting money that is yours. You've paid into this to some extent. Are you being a good steward of it? And that's really what it boils down to. It may seem a little naive, it may seem a little hokey to say, but that's really what it is how can we make sure that we impact the greatest number of students and Texans?
I have something else to say about. Well, I'm going to tell you from my observations, what is the biggest mistake everyone makes in writing a grant award, at least to this particular grant program, and that is they spend pages and pages explaining the problem. And I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't be explaining the problem, but it's somewhat, you're not talking to NIH, you're talking to people in the state of Texas. And so that has to be relevant, something that just supports your basic problem statement, but don't overkill it. Some of this is pretty much common knowledge. And the second thing they do is, after pages and pages of the background information, they spend about 2 paragraphs on the evaluation and expected outcomes. That is not a good scenario to present. You want a balanced proposal. And again, I think we've made an effort in this last RFP to re-emphasize the evaluation and outcomes component of the grant proposal design. Why? Because, again, we're looking for best practices.
And that really, in a way, ties in with what the focus is of this website development grant. We want to be able to communicate with the rest of the state, with your colleagues, what the best practices are. But that means that we have to be able to know what's good, what's best, and what just maybe doesn't quite work yet and needs a little bit more time on it. So the evaluation component is important. 15 points for the resources to perform the project. You need to be able to show that you got the people and the stuff that you need to be able to do it. And 5 points with matching funds. So you should be able to show that there are other folks that are going to be in this fight with you, that you're not going to be going it alone. Okay? 50. Is that right?
Sorry.
I used her numbers.
Is it intended to be 135 points? 125 points.
30, 60, 75, 80.
Well, it should be 130.
Okay.
We're missing 5 there. Good eye, though.
This would be one of those examples about why you need several sets of eyes looking at something and not just 2 sets of eyes. Oh, okay. Again, I also sort of chose a graduate program based on where I didn't have to take math. All right, that's right. Okay, good. Yeah. All right. So any questions about the peer review criteria? Okay. We've been sitting for a while, and I've been standing for a while, so why don't we take about a 15-minute break? It's 10:40 right now. Let's come back about 10:50, 10:55, and we'll have... Some of y'all have come from fars away, and I want to be mindful of our time, and I'm also going to sit down if that's okay with you guys. So, questions? What do we need to talk about that we haven't? And Chris reminded me that there's a few things that I probably need to reiterate, and one is that there are 2 different due dates. There was a mistake in the original RFP for the pipeline grant. So the original RFP for the pipeline grant said October 5th. We caught that and fixed it pretty quickly. But just to reiterate, the due date for that grant is September 28th for the pipeline, and it's October 5th for the website grant. What else was I supposed to? Oh, notice of intent. Today is, again, for the pipeline grant, notices of intent are required. It's not required for the web grant, but it is required for the pipeline grant, and today is the last day for filing a notice of intent. So please be aware of that as well. And the other thing that Chris pointed out is that this isn't a deal breaker on the grants, but it's something to keep in mind is that page limit. Because here's what happens when you exceed the page limit. And it's actually the same thing that used to happen when my students exceeded page limits. We quit reading. In fact, we actually just removed those pages and put them in the recycling bin upstairs. So, you know, that won't necessarily get the grant sent back to you, but it's not going to do you much good. I had a professor in college. I went up the road to Southwestern as an undergrad, and Ellsworth Peterson was this very stereotypical looking music professor. He had the wild white hair and you know, fit at least what I thought a music professor was supposed to fit. And it was very, when you walked into his office, you would look at his bookshelves, and he had this huge dissertation, you know, 500-page dissertation sitting on his bookcase. And somebody asked him, and this sort of became apocryphal, somebody asked him why he wrote a 500-page dissertation, and Ellsworth, and this always stuck with me, Ellsworth said, because I didn't have time to write a 150-page dissertation. And, you know, I think about my own writing process, and it is oftentimes easier to put lots of words in than it is to edit them out and get to the crux of the matter. However, getting to that crux of the matter is important. And my advisor actually in graduate school told me that I had 250 pages to say what I was going to say, and then he was going to stop reading. So same thing here. You got 20 pages to say what you're going to say, and then we're going to stop reading.
Actually, I think 10.
10. Oh, sorry.
And we will tear out the pages. I've torn out an entire evaluation component, and guess what? That particular individual did not win a grant. So they still get a hearing, but chances are that's not going to work.
Sorry.
The only way you win in that situation is if it's your bibliography.
Well, that was actually how I got around it in grad school. All right, so questions? Yes, ma'am. Well, we got to use the microphone for the webcast.
I did have a question about numbers of pages, because some of these grants have, for example, the budget detail is 4 single-sided pages, and in others it's 2 double-sided pages. And, you know, to me, the math works out the same. And when you do a double-sided for some parts of an application, you can't just copy that for its 5 copies without copying the double-sided separately, and then your risk is that those things aren't even included when you go to put together your applications.
You want me to answer that question?
I'll let you answer that one.
Actually, there are 2 reasons for that. A certain amount of continuity in terms of what it is, how easy it is to read things, and whether front to back is more useful than front to front. The other thing is purely psychological for our peer reviewers. We do not pay these people, and we want the proposal to be fairly thin where we think we can save pages. And so we discourage purely single-sided pages.
But the fact that it's not the same
Yes.
in different ones?
Yes. And it has to do with the ability to read the document easily. So I believe the project.
Budget details 2 double, budget details 4 single. That's what my question is.
Between proposals? Well, that's a different matter. I thought you meant within the individual application.
It's like a trick, or it's, I don't know.
No, I think that I wouldn't say that, but I would follow what's in your proposal. There probably was a reason, or it may be that because we use the same templates, we've changed our mind inadvertently and not corrected the other. But at this point, I would just follow what are the instructions in your proposals.
And you feel free to give feedback after the fact. Surely I did not do that good of a job. I can't imagine. Other questions, because this is your opportunity.
I could mention the biannual payments part. We used to send out, I think, as Vanessa mentioned, the information that we would pay you quarterly and we're going to pay you biannually. And that might be significant for a few people who are considering submitting a proposal, because I've gotten comments in the past where people will say, well, we didn't really start the grant until the project until we got our first quarterly allotment. And I assure you that will not work in the short time you have to complete the project you're proposing under this grant period, which is less than 24 months. And so you're going to have an institution or a benefactor that's going to float you monies that will be reimbursed every 6 months through the grant funds distribution.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. In the context of the matching and support, how much of that money has to be on hand at the time of the application, or can it be more in a promissory conditional status?
It can be a promissory status. I mean, what we're asking for is a letter from documentation from the individual or the organization verifying that upon the receipt of the grant they will be matching X percentage of funds. We don't expect that those would be in hand when you are making the application, but there has to be an independent verification that the funds have been promised upon acceptance of the project.
The other question regarding funding is, given that there's a conditional continuation point subject to staff review, how much of that project completion separation is there between the first portion and the second? In other words, it impacts the funding cycle given that there's phases.
Well, and this is something that's good to reiterate. So thank you for asking that. You notice in the RFP, it's very clear that you need to have some of those identifiable objectives that can be completed during that first year, so that there's almost a standalone component. And you do need to be able to show in that first year review that you have met those objectives that you outlined, and that is important. So, and those objectives, you know, we would presume that those objectives are going to be tied to the way that you have also constructed your budget. But it is important to have identifiable objectives that are going to be completed during that first year, so that you can show that you are on task and on target for what your proposal indicated that you were going to be doing.
I have a last question that regards the use of the word regional in the pipeline proposal. The coordinating board has its regions, and the Texas Education Agency has regions. How do these two come together in the use of the word regional?
I'm going to let Chris field that one, since the pipeline's hers.
That's not defined in any particular way. What we're hoping for is a project that will reach beyond the general population of your institution, presumably to several institutions in a reasonably well-defined area, and that would be something you'd want to include in your proposal. What is the region if it's not statewide? One other thing I wanted to mention that's kind of a boogeyman for some people, and that is IRB approval.
Yes.
We've actually had to cancel a grant agreement with an institution because they were not able to get IRB approval. We don't require it up front. There are some grant programs where they do, but you certainly need to include that in your timeline, and we will be asking you about that if that's a necessary component of your grant project design.
And again, as we all know, the timelines that an institution follows and that committees follow oftentimes don't correspond with the timelines we'd like them to follow. So that's, again, is that a nice way of saying it? I'm working on my diplomacy. So that's something that you need to, again, take into consideration in your timeline. And take into consideration with your objectives as well, and particularly since there is that first-year review. So you need to make sure that you give not only yourself plenty of time, but give your institution plenty of time to respond in whatever way and time frame that they typically respond in. Other questions? Chris is the contact person for the Education Pipeline Grant. I'm the contact person for the Website Development Grant. If there are further questions on down the road, remember September 28th and October 5th. Cannot overemphasize that, and just cannot overemphasize the importance of dotting all the I's and crossing all of the proverbial T's. Yes, ma'am. Chris?
Do you have a specific form that we use for the intent, letter of intent, or do we just
No, there's not a specific.
letter?
No, there's not a specific form for the letter intent. Email will be sufficient. Just saying that you're intending to apply.
Oh, and the letter of intent only needs to be on the original proposal, not necessarily on the copies. It's okay if you include it, but generally we only want it for our own file copy. I'm sorry, the letter which will explain your eligibility.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were referring to something different. Okay.
Where are we?
You were asking about the letter of intent that's due today.
Oh, I'm sorry.
An email will suffice for that.
I'm sorry.
An email will suffice for that.
Yes, email will suffice. I was thinking you were talking about the cover letter where you explain your eligibility. And again, that you only need one version of that, and it needs to be on the master copy.
It's something that's not a deal breaker, but is very useful. And I have to admit, I normally wouldn't think of this. On that original copy, things that require signatures, if you could try to get those signed in blue, that's really useful, because otherwise I have to sit there, and I wear trifocals, and otherwise I'm sitting there trying to figure out which is the original copy and which isn't. Yeah. I have to admit, I'd never really thought of that, and I was doing some reading over the weekend, and I'm like, oh yeah, one of the grants that I was looking at asked, I thought, oh, that's a very good idea, sign in blue. So, just one of those little things that makes my life easier. I don't know if you care about that or not, but I thought I'd put in the request.
I could mention two questions that I get commonly, or at least have in the last couple of months when we sent out this RFP. And one is, well, I do research, and some of it relates to health problems that may affect minorities. Can I hire maybe a minority student to help me with this research? And the answer is no. Not really. We want a project that is student-centered. Now, if you designed a training program for students to work with you on research, explaining to them how research is done, making them a better possible student for medicine, nursing, dentistry, public health, etc. That would be a project we would be interested in. Oh, also, here's another one. I'm interested in doing a program in critical thinking for the institution-wide at my institution. And some of the people who will be in this kind of module might go to medical school or may go to nursing school. Is that a project that you would like us to submit a proposal on? Well, no, not really. The focus of any kind of critical thinking, math and science, reading module that you may design should be focused specifically on students who are interested in health education.
Actually,
That was a question I had when I first read this pipeline grant, because it seemed like the overall purpose of the program needs to tie back to public health issues, the way I read that purpose statement. And then when we're talking about it, it's really the pipeline into the professions. Is that sufficient, or do you need then to tie that to the public health issues, emerging diseases and all that kind of stuff?
What we're finding is, and this is, I'm trained as a historian, so I was really interested in going back and looking at the history of this. And you're right, that historically the focus was more specifically directly on the health issues. What we're finding now in Texas, and what we're seeing nationally, and there have been a number of very good national studies that have shown this, is that there is a direct correlation between the diversity of a healthcare workforce and the quality of healthcare for minorities. And there is a very strong and very direct correlation there. And so one of the things now that we're trying to do with this particular grant cycle is look at how do we increase the diversity of the health workforce. Because we know now that by doing that, we're going to see down the road improvements in health issues, in health treatment and health care for minorities and underrepresented groups. What we also know is that we have to take, historians call the longue durée. We have to take a much longer look than what we've been doing. We know that if you start working with a kid, even their freshman year in high school, that everything that they learn builds upon previous years. And so it's really not feasible, or at least it's very, very difficult to get a student who is, say, a freshman in high school who has so many deficiencies from their earlier education to be able to get them successfully into and graduated from a higher education program. So that's another thing that you're saw a little bit, I believe, in the last grant cycle, but picking up a little bit more on in this grant cycle is that pipeline piece. And pipeline has become kind of, in some cases, an overused catchphrase. But it's really more than the phrase of the moment. It really does indicate that there is direct causality and connection. So if we're going to be successful at this point, we have to start looking at preparing them from an earlier point. And so that's one reason why you're picking up on a little bit of that shift. Is there anything that you need to add to that?
I could give you a little bit of history to...
A little bit of history of the grant competitions, and I think they started in 2000, and we funded exactly what you're talking about, Susan. Research, some of it even basic research, most of it applied research on public health issues affecting minorities. But we've kind of extended it beyond that into primarily applied research in one particular competition, then to health services research, and now into educational initiatives primarily with a research component. Because, among other things, it much more aligns with some of the goals of higher education in Texas, particularly our Closing the Gaps plan. Plus, as Vanessa mentioned, the supporting information about a diverse health workforce solves a lot of our healthcare problems affecting minorities in a better way than just researching them directly.
And again, I think to some extent there's sort of a common sense component to this. I know that I'm more comfortable when I go to the doctor's office, and maybe it's just me, but I'm more comfortable when I go to the doctor's office if it's a female doctor than a man. Doesn't matter if they have the same credentials. It's just my own sort of sense of comfort. And we know from some of the studies that have been done that we see that play out in a number of different ways in terms of whether or not folks feel comfortable in a doctor's office, whether or not they feel comfortable discussing their issues, whether or not they feel that the person is approachable, that there's all sorts of other things going on. And it's really, if you're interested, there's been, you can do some Google searches, but there's been some interesting stuff that's come out of NIH, National Institutes for Health, that's looking at some of these issues, and it's showing some pretty compelling research. This won't fix all of our problems, but it's a good component for us to begin to consider in Texas. And particularly now as the demography of Texas is changing so drastically. And whether or not the rest of the U.S. likes it, as Texas goes, the U.S. goes. Other questions? Sure. Well, folks, thank you very much. Wanted to be good stewards of your time, so not going to beat a dead horse if you don't have any other questions. You do have our contact information. Again, September 28th, October 5th. Imprint those days in your minds. And thank y'all very much.
Thank you.